In the winter of 1685, a young courtier named Louis de Rouvroy, soon to become the Duc de Saint-Simon, arrived at Versailles for the first time and witnessed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A woman, dressed in silk and jewels worth more than a peasant village would earn in a century, casually squatting over a chamber pot in the corner of the Hall of Mirrors while continuing her conversation with three other nobles, as if nothing unusual was happening. And in that single moment, Saint-Simon understood the terrible truth that would define his decades at court. That Versailles was not civilization's pinnacle, but rather its most elaborate illusion. A place where humanity's basest functions were performed in humanity's most beautiful rooms. Where the Sun King's absolute power had created not heaven on earth, but a gilded prison where 3,000 souls lived in perpetual performance. Their every movement choreographed, their every breath monitored, their every bodily function a potential political statement. Louis XIV, the man who would rule France for 72 years, longer than any other European monarch in history, did not merely build a palace. He constructed an entire universe with himself as its center, its sun, its God. And to understand Versailles is to understand that it was simultaneously the most magnificent achievement of European civilization and one of its most grotesque perversions. A place where art and architecture reached heights never before achieved, while human dignity sank to depths rarely plumbed. The story begins not with glory, but with humiliation. For Louis XIV was only 5 years old when he became king, and during the civil war known as the Fronde, the young boy king was forced to flee Paris in the middle of the night, standing in his nightshirt in the cold while angry mobs surrounded the palace. And this trauma would shape everything that followed, burning into his mind an absolute conviction that nobility must be controlled, that Paris was dangerous, that power must never again be questioned. When Louis came of age and took personal control of the government in 1661, after the death of Cardinal Mazarin, he made a decision that would reshape France. He would build a palace so magnificent that every noble in the kingdom would beg to live there. And once they arrived, he would trap them in a system so intricate, so all-consuming, that they would have no time, no energy, no resources to ever rebel against him again. The location he chose was unpromising. A swampy, mosquito-infested hunting lodge built by his father, 12 miles from Paris. A place so inhospitable that even his own ministers begged him to reconsider. But Louis saw something they did not. Isolation equals control. And if he could force the nobility to abandon their provincial power bases and live where he determined, under his constant surveillance, he could transform France from a feudal patchwork of semi-independent aristocrats into an absolute monarchy, with himself as its unquestioned master. The construction of Versailles consumed the French treasury and cost thousands of lives, though exact numbers were deliberately obscured, because Louis understood that martyrs to beauty are less troublesome than martyrs to politics. And so when workers died in the malarial swamps, when men fell from scaffolding, when entire crews succumbed to dysentery and typhoid, their bodies were removed at night and buried in unmarked graves. Their deaths never recorded in official accounts. The scale of the project was unprecedented. At its peak, 36,000 workers and 6,000 horses labored simultaneously on the construction, transforming not just a building but an entire landscape, redirecting rivers, creating artificial lakes, moving earth on a scale not seen since Roman times, and all of it driven by one man's vision of absolute magnificence, married to absolute control. The architect, Louis XIV, the landscape designer, André Lenotre, and the painter, Charles Lebrun, worked in concert to create what they called a total work of art. But their masterpiece was built on suffering. And this contradiction, beauty emerging from brutality, would define everything about Versailles. By 1682, Louis officially moved his court to Versailles, and the trap was set. Any noble who wished to advance, to gain favor, to secure positions for their children, had to live at Versailles, or at least maintain a presence there. And suddenly the most powerful families in France found themselves competing not on battlefields or in their ancestral domains, but in a bizarre ritual theater, where the king's morning routine became the most important event of the day. The Lever du Roi, the king's rising ceremony, was not simply a man getting out of bed, but an elaborate hierarchy of privilege, where different ranks of nobility had the honor of performing different tasks, the most prestigious being the right to hand Louis his shirt. And grown men, warriors whose ancestors had fought in the Crusades, would scheme and bribe and humiliate themselves for the chance to stand in the king's bedroom and watch him put on his clothes. This was the genius of Louis XIV's system. He transformed potentially dangerous military aristocrats into courtiers obsessed with minutiae. Men who once commanded armies now spent their days memorizing the complex etiquette of who could sit in the king's presence, who could knock on doors versus who had to scratch, who could pass through which rooms at which times, and every detail, every tiny privilege was a gift from the king that could be revoked at any moment, ensuring that everyone's attention remained fixed not on plotting rebellion, but on maintaining their position in this elaborate game. The court day was structured around the king's schedule with religious precision. He rose at 8, heard mass at 10, held council meetings in the morning, dined publicly at 1 in what was called the Grand Couvert, where hundreds of people would watch him eat, spent afternoons hunting or walking in the gardens, attended evening entertainments, had supper at 10, and retired around midnight, and every single one of these events was an opportunity for courtiers to be seen, to demonstrate their loyalty, to catch the king's eye or suffer his displeasure by absence. Madame de Maintenon, who became Louis's secret wife after the death of his official queen, left accounts describing the exhaustion of court life, how nobles would stand for hours in freezing galleries waiting for a glimpse of the king, how elderly courtiers would faint from standing through entire ceremonies but refuse to leave because absence would be noticed and interpreted as disloyalty, how the constant performance extracted a psychological toll that manifested in the bizarre behaviors that became normalized at Versailles. The palace itself was a marvel that violated every principle of human comfort in service of visual magnificence. The Hall of Mirrors, completed in 1684, stretched 240 feet long and contained 357 mirrors, an almost unimaginable luxury when mirrors were phenomenally expensive. But it had no heating system adequate for its size, no proper ventilation, and no toilets, which brings us to one of the most shocking aspects of daily life at Versailles. In the most beautiful palace ever built, everyone from the king to the lowest courtier had to relieve themselves wherever convenient, because there were almost no toilets and no plumbing system. Chamber pots were used constantly and often emptied out windows into the gardens. Stairwells became impromptu urinals, and worse, corners of even the grandest rooms reeked of human waste. And perfume became not a luxury but a necessity to mask the omnipresent stench of thousands of people living in close quarters without adequate sanitation. Foreign visitors were consistently shocked by this contrast. The Duchess of Orleans wrote letters describing how people would defecate in hallways, behind tapestries, even on balconies, and how the beautiful gardens featured strategically placed groves not for romantic trysts, but because they served as outdoor toilets for desperate courtiers caught too far from their chambers. The king himself was not exempt from these indignities. Louis XIV suffered from chronic digestive problems, possibly due to his enormous appetite and the rich foods he consumed, and his bowel movements were matters of state, discussed by his doctors, reported to his ministers, analyzed for signs of royal health, and he frequently held meetings while sitting on his chaise percée, his toilet chair, conducting the business of Europe's most powerful nation while relieving himself. The courtiers developed their own strategies for managing these bodily necessities. Women wore elaborate gowns with hidden openings and would squat discreetly during conversations. Men would excuse themselves to corners during card games, and servants maintained a constant battle against the filth, though they were fighting a losing war against 3,000 residents and inadequate infrastructure. Enjoying the video so far? Let's take a quick break. Just like the good old TV days, if you've ever wanted to bring your stories, documentaries, or even YouTube videos to life with ultra-realistic AI voices, then you need to check out 11 Labs. It's the same powerful tool that creators, filmmakers, and educators around the world are using to turn plain text into captivating, human-like narration, instantly. Whether you're building your next viral short, narrating an audiobook, or voicing your AI character, 11 Labs gives you crystal clear quality and emotional tone that sounds real. So if you're curious or ready to start creating amazing voiceovers like this one, head to the link in the description and explore 11 Labs for yourself. All right, break's over. Let's get back to the video. The irony was deliberate in some sense. Louis wanted his nobles close, wanted them dependent, wanted them uncomfortable enough that they couldn't relax into complacency, but not so uncomfortable that they would leave. And the lack of privacy, the constant proximity, the absence of basic facilities all served to keep everyone slightly off balance, slightly desperate, slightly willing to endure anything for the king's favor. Hygiene practices that seem shocking by modern standards were normal for the era, but reached particular extremes at Versailles. Bathing was rare, bathing perhaps once a month if that, because contemporary medical theory held that water could penetrate the skin and cause illness. So people would wipe themselves with linen cloths and apply layers of powder and perfume instead. And Louis himself was fastidious by the standards of his time, but this meant changing his shirt 3 times a day and using perfumed water to wipe his face and hands, rather than actually bathing with any regularity. The lead-based makeup that women wore was slowly poisoning them, causing skin problems that required more makeup to cover, creating a vicious cycle that left many courtiers with scarred, damaged skin beneath their white paint. And the fashion for beauty marks, small patches of fabric placed on the face, originated partly to cover smallpox scars that almost everyone had since the disease was endemic and killed or disfigured nobles and peasants alike without discrimination. The king's own appearance became a matter of state concern. He was only 5 foot 4 inches tall, so he wore high-heeled shoes, sometimes with heels 4 inches high, and this fashion spread through the court until men were tottering around in heels that would make modern runway models jealous. And Louis wore elaborate wigs that added another foot to his height, and these wigs became so essential to court life that nobles would sometimes receive visitors while their wigs were being dressed, sitting in their nightshirts with bare heads because being seen without their wig was less shameful than missing an important social opportunity. The cost of maintaining appearances at Versailles was ruinous. Nobles were expected to have multiple elaborate outfits, to gamble at the king's card tables even when they couldn't afford it, to contribute to royal entertainments, to maintain suitably impressive accommodations, even though rooms at the palace were notoriously inadequate. And families that had been wealthy for generations found themselves bankrupted by a few years at court, which was exactly what Louis intended, because broke nobles were dependent nobles who couldn't afford to raise armies or fund rebellions. The Marquise de Montespan, one of Louis's most famous mistresses, reportedly spent 600,000 livres on her wardrobe in a single year, an amount that could have fed thousands of peasant families, and her apartments required constant redecoration to maintain her position. And she bathed in milk and wore perfumes made from rare ingredients shipped from across the world. And even she eventually fell from favor when Louis tired of her, demonstrating that no amount of wealth or beauty could guarantee security in a system where the king's whim was absolute law. The sexual politics of Versailles were equally baroque and brutal. Louis had official mistresses whose positions were recognized and formalized, who bore him children that were legitimized and given titles, and the queen was expected to smile and be gracious to women who shared her husband's bed, and this arrangement was considered civilized and proper. a mark of sophistication that distinguished the French court from supposedly barbarous nations where such things weren't openly acknowledged. Madame de Montespan bore Louis 7 children while his wife was still alive, and these children were raised at court, given apartments, married into the highest nobility, and their mother's position as official mistress gave her more power than many ministers until she made the mistake of being linked to the affair of the poisons, a scandal that revealed that aristocratic women were purchasing poisons, abortion drugs, and love potions from a network of fortune-tellers and alleged witches. And when investigators discovered that some of these women had apparently poisoned their husbands to inherit their estates, or had attempted to poison the king's food to benefit their own children's position, Louis was forced to shut down the investigation before it implicated too many important people, burning evidence and imprisoning witnesses indefinitely without trial to prevent even more shocking revelations. The affair of the poisons revealed the desperation underlying the glamour. Women with no legal rights, whose marriages were arranged for political advantage, whose husbands could imprison them or exile them to convents on a whim, were using the only weapons available to them. And the investigation uncovered black masses where aristocratic ladies allegedly participated in rituals involving infant sacrifice. Whether these accusations were true or extracted through torture remains debated, but the fact that they were plausible tells us something about how Versailles was perceived even by contemporaries. The treatment of children at court was another area where magnificence and cruelty intersected. Royal and noble children were raised by servants, rarely saw their parents, were subjected to frequent medical treatments that by modern standards constitute torture, including regular purges and bloodletting that began in infancy, and their marriages were arranged in childhood, with no consideration for their feelings or desires. They were chess pieces in dynastic strategies, and their bodies were commodities to be traded for alliances. The Dauphin, Louis's eldest legitimate son, grew up in the most magnificent palace in Europe, but was emotionally neglected, subject to brutal educational methods that included regular beatings when his lessons weren't learned perfectly. And he developed into a timid, melancholy man who never ruled because he predeceased his father, dying at age 49, likely of smallpox, having spent his entire life waiting for a throne he would never occupy. The construction and maintenance of Versailles consumed a significant portion of France's national budget during Louis's reign. Estimates suggest that between 5 and 10% of total government revenue went to the palace and court, and this was during a period when France was fighting almost continuous wars, when crop failures caused famines, when taxes on peasants were already crushing, and Louis simply kept building, kept expanding, kept demanding more magnificence regardless of the cost to his subjects. The gardens alone required an army of workers. At one point, 1,400 fountains operated simultaneously, but there wasn't enough water pressure to run them all at once, so an elaborate system developed where gardeners would signal ahead as the king walked, so that fountains in his path would be turned on just before he arrived and turned off after he passed, maintaining the illusion of endless abundance while actually desperately conserving resources. And this seems almost too perfect a metaphor for the entire Versailles system. This beautiful lie maintained through frantic, hidden labor. The machine de Marly, built to pump water from the Seine to supply Versailles, was one of the most complex mechanical systems in the world, requiring 14 water wheels driving 221 pumps to lift water over 150 meters in elevation. And it was never fully successful, constantly breaking down, producing an incessant noise that drove nearby residents mad, and consuming massive resources just to provide enough water for Louis's fountains and gardens, not for drinking or sanitation, but for display. The king's personal daily routine involved rituals that strike modern observers as absurd, but were deadly serious political theater. The grand couvert, his public dinner, wasn't simply a meal but a carefully choreographed ceremony where the king ate alone at a table while hundreds watched. And precise rules governed who could stand where. And the food itself, prepared in kitchens far from the dining room, arrived barely warm after being carried through long corridors. But the point wasn't culinary pleasure but visual magnificence. The display of abundance, the reminder of hierarchy. Louis would consume enormous quantities at these meals. Accounts describe him eating 4 plates of different soups, an entire pheasant, a partridge, a large plate of salad, mutton, 2 good pieces of ham, a plate of pastries plus fruit and hard-boiled eggs, all at a single meal. And his doctors worried about his health but couldn't tell the Sun King to eat less. And this gluttony while peasants starved was not hypocrisy but the entire point. The king's ability to consume without limit demonstrated his power, his transcendence of normal human limitations. The entertainment at Versailles was equally extravagant. Molière and Racine premiered plays written specifically for the court. Lully composed operas. Elaborate ballets featured the king himself dancing in his youth, though he stopped after 1670, perhaps because at 32 he could no longer maintain the illusion of divine grace. And these entertainments cost fortunes, required months of rehearsal, employed hundreds of performers, and were often performed once or twice before being abandoned for the next spectacle. The king's gambling nights were command performances. Nobles were expected to attend, expected to play, expected to lose gracefully when the king won, which he usually did because cheating the king wasn't really cheating but rather fulfilling one's duty. And courtiers would deliberately lose thousands to gain royal favor, bankrupting themselves in a single evening while maintaining perfect smiles. The spiritual life of Versailles was as contradictory as everything else. Louis attended Mass daily, considered himself the most Christian king, persecuted Protestants until the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685 forced hundreds of thousands of Huguenots to flee France or convert. Yet his personal life violated Catholic teaching constantly, and no one at court saw any contradiction in the king emerging from his mistress's bed to attend Mass where he would take communion. Because the king's relationship with God was different from ordinary mortals. He ruled by divine right. His sins were between him and God alone, and mere mortals didn't have standing to judge. The court chapel, begun in 1699 and completed in 1710, was deliberately designed so that the king's gallery was at the same level as the altar, spatially equating Louis with God. And during services, the congregation was expected to face the king as much as the altar, because in the theology of Versailles the two were nearly equivalent. The decline of Louis's court began long before his death. By the early 1700s, the king was in his 60s, increasingly influenced by his pious secret wife, Madame de Maintenon. The entertainment grew more subdued. The mourning for dead relatives became almost constant as Louis's children and grandchildren died in rapid succession. And the glamour faded while the control mechanisms remained, leaving a system that was all prison and no pleasure. The final years of Louis's reign were marked by military defeats, financial crisis, famine, and the dying off of his legitimate heirs until his succession passed to his 5-year-old great-grandson. And through all this, the court rituals continued with perfect precision, because that's what rituals are for, to provide structure when everything else is collapsing. Louis XIV died on September 1st, 1715, from gangrene that spread from his leg, and his death took weeks, a slow, agonizing decay of the Sun King's body that was documented in horrifying detail by his doctors and courtiers, and he bore it with remarkable courage, apologizing to those around him for being such a troublesome patient, maintaining the royal performance to the very end. The legacy of Versailles is impossible to summarize neatly. It was simultaneously one of humanity's greatest artistic achievements and a monument to inequality and cruelty, a place where beauty and horror were so intertwined that they became inseparable. And perhaps that's the point. Perhaps we can't have absolute magnificence without absolute cost. Perhaps Louis XIV understood something about power and spectacle that we prefer not to acknowledge, which is that control requires theater, that authority needs architecture, that making people endure small humiliations and large discomforts in pursuit of beauty and favor will keep them too occupied to rebel. And in that sense, Versailles worked perfectly. The French nobility never again posed a serious threat to royal authority until the entire system collapsed in revolution 74 years after Louis's death. And when it did collapse, Versailles stood as the ultimate symbol of everything the revolutionaries hated, not despite its beauty but because of it, because the people had finally done the math and realized that this magnificence was built on their suffering. These gardens were watered with their taxes. These halls were warmed by their labor, and the golden mask had finally slipped to reveal the skull beneath. Louis XIV proved that you can trap an entire aristocracy with beauty and ritual. What other gilded cages has history built, and who paid the price? Subscribe to discover more dark sides of history's golden ages.